And before I do that, just a challenging, radical, depressing thought, and that is that climate change, which we've been aware of, in a sense, only since the 1970s, I know the research goes back to the 1890s, through the 1950s and so on, but it got into the popular media in the 1970s, may only be the first of the shocks that our planet and its population could cop. We could be facing an even more dramatic challenge from changes in the world's oceans. Climate change is about the world's atmosphere, but in the meantime, what's happening to the change in the composition, not of the atmosphere, but of the oceans? And how does that feed back into climate? And could that be building up to hit us as dramatically as what's happening to the atmosphere? And there's also a view that the general toxicity of human activity could be poisoning our atmosphere, our oceans, our land, and could represent another crisis to hit humankind. Just entertain this thought for a moment, that climate change might be the first of the shocks, not the ultimate shock, just the first of the shocks. China and India. We can't, nothing makes me angrier, apart from climate change denial, the voodoo anti-science of climate change denial, than this silly view you hear in American presidential campaigns and occasionally in Australia: why should we act before India and China act? Well, stupid, we put it there to start with. We got rich industrialising, and we banked the carbon and the 5 other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We did it, getting rich. We're rich today. Being an Australian today, for the most part, is travelling super first class on the planet. Other countries are trying to get to our living standards and trying to do it as fast as they can. We need to set an example. And the example we should set is of putting a price on carbon. You do that through an emissions trading scheme, and pushing renewables, advancing our transition to a less carbon intensive, ultimately a non-carbon economy. It is hard. 2 examples. Land clearing. Important, because it's the only reason Australia is going to achieve its Kyoto targets. In 1995, I asked my officials to come up with bans on land clearing that would be effective. Being flawed politicians, we came up with heavy-handed and bureaucratic interventions. And we had a running fight with the farmers of New South Wales, who campaigned vigorously against the government in the 1999 state election, because we weren't allowing them, effectively, they said, to mow their lawns like they'd be able to mow their lawns if they had a city property. We got into arguments about stopping farmers clearing woody weed and all the rest. We won, we stood firm, and Queensland came in when Peter Beattie lost patience with his farmers and took them on with bans on broadacre land clearing. Because of those actions by 2 state governments, Australia will reach, more or less, its Kyoto targets, but only because of those actions at a state level on land clearing. But they were ferocious arguments. It is not easy to act. Let's not kid that it's easy to act. But here's a second challenge from the other end of the spectrum. We introduced what has been recognised by the World Bank as being the world's first carbon trading scheme. The New South Wales G-Gas scheme, it came in January 2003. It capped the emission levels on a per capita basis of the stationary electricity industry in New South Wales and forced them to buy offsets. What it's done is to gift to Australia a good body of regulations that can be adopted, will be adopted, are being adopted in the design of a national emissions trading scheme. And it was a very good experience, but my problem with that was the opposite of the battles on land clearing. The media refused to report it. They just ignored it. And when you hear the media complain about politicians on both sides being devoted to spin, not policy substance, I always respond by saying, when you've got a serious slab of policy that's a little bit difficult to explain, you simply refuse to report it, and nobody hears about it. Here was the world's first carbon trading scheme, introduced 2 years before the European scheme, and 10 states in the northeast of the United States in September this year have started an identical scheme. Identical with the New South Wales G-Gas scheme that started in January 2003. So leadership on this issue, finding common ground on this issue, You'll either encounter ferocious opposition where an interest is challenged, or you'll find studied, calculated media neglect of the subject, and thus a huge challenge in building public support. Here are some very practical policy proposals. One, we've got to get on with designing our scheme in Australia. I'm pretty confident the Rudd government is not going to compromise, and that according to the timetable developed by Garneau, developed in the Green Paper, we will have this presented at the end of the year, and we'll proceed with legislation. Now, I hope nobody in the Cabinet wobbles or wavers, and I hope on the other side of politics, the coalition doesn't adopt this idea that you block it for 1 year in the Senate. I agreed